continual crisis since the 1980s, which has not been resolved. I'm mainly talking about Britain. Britain's relative industrial decline, which basically means we barely produce anything in this country. I mean, manufacturing is a tiny proportion of the British economy, and it's been declining for, well, basically since the turn of the 20th century. Britain's relative industrial decline has been combined, though, with a dynamic, aggressive, imperialist expansion of commerce and finance overseas. And this development has now reached utterly unprecedented levels, which I'll talk about a little later. The City of London has always been at the heart of the British state. The crisis has strengthened this bond to a new level of intensity. The result of the crisis has therefore seen a further consolidation of finance capital and the state. That is, the further development of what has been called in the literature state monopoly capitalism or imperialism. The speculative activities of the financial corporations and the uncontrolled lending that fueled the unprecedented property booms in the main capitalist countries led to the biggest financial meltdown in history. The capitalist system survived this process because the state underwrote the debts of the banks and financial institutions on a scale never seen before. By 2009, the total support for the financial system from governments and central banks reached an unprecedented $14,000 billion in the UK, in the US, and the Eurozone, almost equivalent to a quarter of global GDP. I mean, quite staggering. The rapid rise in state borrowing and increased public spending was necessary not only to prevent capitalist economies from falling into even deeper recession, but also to ensure the survival of the imperialist banks and financial institutions. In the case of the UK, total government gross debt was 44% of GDP in 2007 and had risen to 68.2% in 2009. The US saw a rise from 62.1% of GDP to 83.2%. Germany from 65% to 72.5%. France from 63.8% to 77.4%. And Japan, listen to this, from 187.7% to 217.5% over the same period. That's what happened. That's the measure of how the capitalist system was temporarily saved in this period of 2 years. So the debate about when and how much to cut public borrowing is an ideological diversion. It is little more than a cover for the ruling class as it prepares a massive attack on the living standards of working people in a brutal attempt to lay the foundation for resolving this crisis of imperialism. At the end of 2008, more than a year into the present crisis, Britain's overseas assets reached a staggering £7,135 billion. £7,135 billion. An unprecedented 5 times Britain's GDP. Now we've heard that the assets of the banks in this country are about 5 times Britain's GDP, but we've never heard anything about the overseas assets of this country. No one talks about it. No one talks about these amazing figures. That the overseas assets of Britain are 5 times the GDP. In fact, they've redone those figures recently. And if I can find them, they do this all the time. But this time, they're even more fantastic. They've added the financial derivatives. These are these, things that the banks do to make money out of nothing, or money out of money. Financial derivatives. They've added them, and they were a massive £4,040 billion. Financial derivatives of UK banks alone, £4,040 billion. This is just amazing. I mean, what is it, 2.5 times the GDP, something like that? And he took the foreign assets on these new figures of the UK to £10,980 billion. The GDP is about £1,400 billion, so that gives you some idea of what we're talking about. And that's nearly 7.5 times Britain's GDP. There's no other country in the world that gets anywhere near that. If you want to compare, the United States foreign assets are about 1 times its GDP, maybe a little less, right? 7.5 times Britain's GDP. I mean, what's going on? Now, 59.60%, let's leave the points out of it. 60% of these assets, or 3 times Britain's GDP, are listed under other investments. That's very typical, actually. The largest part of Britain's foreign investments come under the category of other investment. They don't tell you what they are, but you can work it out. I mean, essentially, are loans and deposits abroad by UK banks, which we could call a gigantic usury capital. What do we mean by usury? We mean borrowing cheap and selling dear. Used to be against the major religions, didn't it? Major religions used to be against usury. Not anymore. Usury is absolutely right at the centre of British capitalism. That's how it functions, as a giant usury capital, sort of an offshore centre for capital all over the world. And every single government in this country wants to keep it that way. Now why? Well, Britain's foreign assets were nearly matched by foreign liabilities of about £7,042 billion on the old figures I was giving you. And there were net assets of about £93 billion. It's neither here nor there, really, whether they're net assets or net deficits. The most important thing is the net earnings on the international investment account. That's what matters. How much do you earn from this usury capital? Borrowing cheap and sort of selling dear kind of thing. Well, British capitalism earned in 2007 £27.6 billion. Right. In 2008, the year I'm dealing with at the moment, Britain had a balance of payments deficit of £25.1 billion, something like 1.7% of the GDP. That is, it was spending 1.7% of the GDP more than it earned. We were living above what we were earning, if you like. The deficit on trading goods reached a massive £92.9 billion in 2008, which is about 6.5% of the GDP. Without the large surplus on services trade of £54.5 billion, with financial services responsible for more than 70% of this, and the income flow from the international investment account, I said, was £27.6 billion, the standard of living of the British people would have significantly fallen. That's how important this is to keeping the social stability of Britain intact.